Qin Shi Huang.
In ancient China, a young king named Ying Zhang rose from internal warfare to become the first emperor of a united China. But with unification came control. As Qin Shi Huang, he imposed a singular vision of order, erasing opposing ideas, outlawing alternative philosophies, and standardizing everything from currency to script. He ordered vast walls to be built, not just to keep invaders out, but to remind his own people of his reach. Scholars who disagreed with him vanished. Their writings, if not approved, were incinerated. He saw ideas as weapons and silenced them accordingly. His obsession with order extended to his own legacy. Tens of thousands labored in silence to create a sprawling tomb guarded by silent clay soldiers. Even in rest, his grip remained tight. Across the world, in Rome, another ruler embraced chaos rather than order. Caligula inherited an empire and almost immediately turned it into his personal stage. What began as a popular rule quickly descended into cruelty cloaked in spectacle. Those who questioned him were humiliated or removed, sometimes for amusement, other times out of paranoia. He declared himself a living god and demanded temples in his honor. He lavished money on games while his people struggled, turned laws into jokes, and even made his horse a priest to mock the Senate. Behind the show was a man who ruled without limits, whose whims shaped the fate of Rome. His reign was short, but left behind a model of rule driven by ego and fear, a performance with real consequences. From the wind-swept steppes of Mongolia rose a warrior who would reshape the known world. Genghis Khan began with nothing, no wealth, no powerful allies, only a fierce determination and an unmatched ability to command. He united warring tribes with a mixture of loyalty, fear, and swift retaliation. Once in power, he launched a campaign across Asia that left entire civilizations transformed or erased. Cities that resisted were leveled, their leaders publicly removed as examples. Yet alongside this fury came order, a legal code, protection for merchants, and a network of communication that stretched farther than any before. He was both builder and breaker, creating an empire larger than Rome, ruled not from palaces, but on horseback, fast, ruthless, and unstoppable. Decades later, another conqueror sought to revive the spirit of Mongol dominance, but with even fewer constraints. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, carved through Central Asia, Persia, and India, leaving a trail of destruction that stunned chroniclers. He styled himself as both a restorer of order and a chosen sword of fate. Cities were emptied to send a message. Towers were built from the remains of the defeated. Yet he saw himself as a patron of culture, commissioning grand mosques and gardens, even as he razed capitals. His empire was stitched together not by administration, but by fear, a fragile giant built on terror and legend. To his enemies, his name meant the end. To history, it meant ambition unchecked.
Ivan IV ascended the Russian throne as a child and grew into a ruler whose name would echo with dread. As Tsar, Ivan the Terrible transformed Muscovy into a centralized state, but the cost was staggering. He created a secret police force loyal only to him, unleashing them on towns suspected of disloyalty. Nobles were stripped of power, entire families were erased, and regions were devastated to root out rebellion. Ivan's paranoia deepened with age. He distrusted allies, turned against his own advisors, and in a fit of rage struck down his own heir, a moment that left the future of the dynasty in doubt. His rule left Russia larger and more centralized, but also soaked in repression and fear, setting a pattern that would repeat through centuries. Across Europe, in revolutionary France, a lawyer with sharp ideals turned the promise of liberty into an era of fear. Maximilien Robespierre believed that virtue could only survive when protected by force. He rose during the chaos of the French Revolution, demanding justice for the common man and punishment for those he labeled enemies of the Republic. With careful words and cold precision, he oversaw trials where guilt was assumed and final verdicts swift. The guillotine became the symbol of his rule, and thousands were condemned under his vision of purity. Yet the circle turned. As rivals grew wary and the crowds grew restless, Robespierre met the same fate he had so often ordered. His downfall ended a chapter of terror written in the name of reason.
While ruling a small European nation, Leopold II set his sights far beyond its borders. In the late 19th century, he claimed the Congo as his personal possession, framing it as a humanitarian project. In reality, it became a brutal extraction zone where millions suffered under forced labor. Rubber quotas were enforced with unspeakable cruelty. Entire villages were punished for failing to meet demands. Colonial officers and private agents acted with impunity, driven by profit and protected by distance. Leopold never set foot in the land he controlled, but his orders shaped lives on the ground. Reports eventually reached Europe and a scandal erupted, but by then the damage had been done. Under a banner of civilization, one of history's most devastating private regimes had quietly unfolded. In the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin rose from obscurity to absolute control. Through purges, show trials, and forced relocations, he engineered a system where fear ensured obedience. Those seen as threats, whether real or imagined, were removed without hesitation. Entire populations were uprooted. Millions were sent to labor camps where survival was rare. A devastating famine followed his forced agricultural reforms, taking more lives than many wars. Yet even as repression spread, Stalin built his image as a guardian of progress. He led the USSR through industrial transformation and emerged from the Second World War as a global superpower. But behind the rise stood a nation bent under the weight of silence, shaped by a leader who demanded loyalty at any cost.
Adolf Hitler's rise began not with conquest, but with speeches filled with blame, fire, and promises of restoration. He tapped into a broken Germany, offering pride after defeat and unity after division. Once in power, he wasted no time dismantling democratic structures, outlying opposition, and positioning himself as the singular voice of the nation. Under his rule, persecution became policy. A sweeping apparatus was built to track, isolate, and remove those he labeled enemies. What followed was an era of militarization, invasion, and systemic violence that engulfed Europe. Entire communities vanished as part of his ideology-driven vision. The war he launched led to ruin on an unimaginable scale, and yet he clung to command until the very end, leaving behind a legacy defined by destruction. In neighboring Italy, Benito Mussolini took a different route to the same destination. A former journalist, he capitalized on national frustration after World War I and presented himself as the strong hand Italy needed. With marches, uniforms, and a new political movement, he dismantled the old order and declared himself the only authority. He silenced opposition through prison, exile, or worse, and built a state where obedience was the highest virtue. Propaganda filled public spaces, rewriting the present and reshaping the past. His dreams of empire led him into reckless wars and eventually into a disastrous alliance with Germany. As the war turned against him, his power collapsed, and the people who once chanted his name abandoned him. The man who promised order left his country in ashes. In wartime Japan, Hideki Tojo became the face of militarism, loyalty, and total control. Rising from a strict military background, he saw expansion as both destiny and necessity. As prime minister during World War II, he approved aggressive moves across Asia and the Pacific, believing swift dominance would secure Japan's future. Under his leadership, the military committed severe abuses, from forced labor to mass suffering in occupied territories. Tojo's rule blurred the lines between government and army, where opposition was not only discouraged but dangerous. He pushed for relentless conflict, even when defeat became likely, and only surrendered his position when Japan neared collapse. After the war, he faced judgment, but the scars of his era stretched far beyond any courtroom. Across the sea in Spain, Francisco Franco rose amid civil war and held power for decades through calculated suppression. Backed by foreign forces and domestic elites, he emerged from the wreckage of a fractured nation with a clear goal: eliminate opposition and restore his vision of order. Franco's rule silenced rival voices through censorship, secret police, and long imprisonment. Mass arrests and military tribunals became tools of governance. He offered stability but demanded silence. Over time, Spain modernized, but political freedoms remained tightly chained. Franco carefully positioned himself above politics, portraying his hand as steady and inevitable. Even in his final years, he shaped succession plans to ensure his legacy endured. His rule outlasted many, held together not by charisma, but by fear and calculation.
In Cambodia, Pol Pot dreamed of creating a perfect society, one without cities, classes, or outside influence. But to achieve that vision, he tore the country apart. He emptied urban centers, forcing millions into rural labor under extreme conditions. Schools were shut down, professionals were targeted, and even wearing glasses could mark someone as suspect. Families were separated, and trust was replaced by surveillance. Those who resisted or simply failed to meet impossible quotas disappeared into the shadows of remote camps. His regime lasted only a few years, but in that short time, the country's population was drastically reduced. The scale of his policies shocked the world, not for their complexity, but for their cold simplicity. Rebuild a society by first destroying it. Further north, Kim Il-sung crafted a state built entirely around himself. After the Korean War, he established a regime in North Korea where he was more than a leader. He was the center of every story, the face on every wall, the answer to every problem. Through a mix of extreme isolation, military focus, and rigid ideology, he turned the country into a sealed world. Information was tightly controlled, borders were locked, and loyalty became a matter of survival. Generations were taught to revere him, not just as a leader, but as a parental figure beyond question. He built a dynasty, one that would continue through his descendants, rooted in fear, myth, and unbroken control. To the outside world, it looked like a fortress. To those inside, it was simply reality.
Kim Jong-il inherited not just power, but an entire reality shaped by his father. Stepping into leadership, he preserved the image of unshakable control while tightening the mechanisms that kept North Korea sealed. He fostered a culture of idolization, films, literature, and schoolbooks all centered around his brilliance. Behind the staged parades and carefully crafted appearances, the country faced chronic hardship. Resources dwindled, but military spending remained high. International isolation deepened, yet the regime endured, held together by secrecy and the fear of speaking even a whisper of doubt. He maintained his grip not with grand speeches, but with silence and surveillance, a government where expression meant risk and trust was rare even within families. When Kim Jong-un took over, many predicted instability. Young, relatively unknown, and untested, he quickly proved that the dynasty's methods would remain intact. He eliminated rivals early, including close family members, and presented a public image carefully designed to mirror his grandfather's. Nuclear development accelerated, and global tension followed. Inside the country, little changed. The same isolation, the same endless praise, the same tight web of control. While foreign media speculated about reform, Kim made clear that his rule would be marked by continuity, not compromise. With modern branding and old-school repression, he maintained one of the most rigid systems of control in the modern world, reinforcing a legacy built on absolute power passed from father to son.
Mao Zedong began as a revolutionary and ended as an icon both revered and feared. After leading the Communist Party to victory in China's Civil War, He launched sweeping reforms meant to reshape every corner of society. But in doing so, he dismantled traditional structures and set new rules with devastating consequences. The Great Leap Forward, intended to transform agriculture and industry, led to widespread collapse and widespread suffering. Years later, he unleashed the Cultural Revolution, turning young citizens into enforcers of ideological purity. Schools, temples, and families were torn apart in the name of revolution. Public loyalty became a survival strategy, and even long-serving allies could fall out of favor overnight. Mao's portrait hung everywhere, but beneath the image was a nation struggling under the weight of constant upheaval. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein built a regime where the appearance of unity masked deep control. Rising through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party, he consolidated power by eliminating rivals and tightening his grip on every institution. Public displays of loyalty were expected, while behind closed doors, fear ensured obedience. He waged wars with neighboring countries, used extreme force to crush internal dissent, and directed the state's strength against ethnic groups seen as threats. The capital saw development and grandeur, but far from Baghdad, surveillance and punishment kept people quiet. Internationally, he played between diplomacy and provocation until global pressure escalated into war. Even then, Saddam presented himself as defiant, the center of a system he built to serve him alone.
Muammar Gaddafi seized power in Libya with promises of reform and national pride. Young and charismatic, he presented himself as a man of the people, but over time, his rule became a strange blend of ideology, spectacle, and force. He crafted a political theory called the Green Book, which replaced formal institutions with vague ideas centered around him. Opposition disappeared from public life, and surveillance networks crept into every corner of society. Gaddafi styled himself as a pan-African leader and international voice, while at home, dissent was either silenced or pushed underground. His regime weathered sanctions, coups, and condemnation, all held together by oil wealth and a firm grip on power. As protests swept the region decades later, he vowed never to step down, choosing confrontation over compromise until the very end. In Chile, Augusto Pinochet took power following a military coup that ended decades of democracy. He promised to restore order, but his methods were swift and uncompromising. Political opponents were arrested, exiled, or simply disappeared. The country's institutions were reshaped to protect military authority, and a climate of silence settled over public life. While markets opened and the economy modernized, civil liberties remained frozen. International criticism grew, but Pinochet stood firm, justifying his rule as a necessary correction. Over time, a carefully controlled referendum chipped away at his legitimacy. Even as he stepped down, he ensured legal protections for himself, leaving behind a country more stable but deeply scarred by repression and fear.
Fidel Castro's revolution began as a fight against dictatorship, but once in power, he became the symbol of unbending rule himself. After overthrowing Batista's regime in Cuba, he promised justice, education, and equality, and for many, he delivered some of that. But alongside progress came a state where dissent was quickly labeled treason. Independent media vanished, political parties dissolved, and critics found themselves silenced or removed. The island's every decision funneled through Fidel, speeches lasting hours, policies shaped by ideology, and loyalty above all. While admired by some abroad for resisting foreign pressure, at home, voices faded under the weight of control. Decades passed, and the man who once spoke of liberation ruled until illness finally forced him to step aside. In the isolated mountains of Albania, Enver Hoxha created a state where suspicion became law. Inspired by Stalin, he built a regime that turned inward, cutting ties with both East and West. Foreign influences were declared dangerous, religion was outlawed, and even minor deviations from official ideology were punished harshly. Citizens lived under constant watch, unsure of who might be listening or reporting. Hoxha ordered the construction of thousands of concrete bunkers, fearing invasion from enemies real or imagined. As the world changed, Albania remained frozen in place, trapped by one man's obsession with purity and control.
When Hoxha died, the country emerged blinking into a reality it had been sealed off from for generations.
Slobodan Milošević came to power with nationalist rhetoric that reignited deep divisions in the Balkans. In the fragile remains of Yugoslavia, he fueled old grievances, portraying himself as a protector of the Serbian people. But protection soon gave way to aggression. Under his leadership, wars broke out across the region, and with them came sieges, forced expulsions, and grave abuses against civilians. Milošević used media as a weapon, stoking fear and loyalty while painting enemies both at home and abroad. Political opponents were sidelined or undermined, and the country's institutions became tools for prolonging his rule. Eventually, the same international forces he defied brought him to trial, a rare case where a head of state was held to account for policies that shattered a region. In Romania, Nicolae Ceaușescu rose through the Communist Party with calculated charm, then transformed himself into an untouchable figure at the top of a cult-like regime. Public life revolved around him and his wife, Elena, whose portraits appeared in classrooms, factories, and homes. Behind the images was a state plagued by surveillance, rationing, and fear. Ceaușescu's policies drained the economy while he pursued grand construction projects and exported much-needed resources abroad to maintain an image of strength. Hospitals lacked medicine, stores were empty, yet his speeches praised progress. As Eastern Europe began to change, Ceaușescu refused to bend. His downfall came suddenly, not through invasion, but from his own people, an abrupt end to decades of rigid control dressed in propaganda.
Idi Amin rose from the ranks of Uganda's military to seize power in a coup, promising order and national pride. What followed was a reign defined by unpredictability and fear. He expelled tens of thousands of citizens based on ethnicity, dismantled institutions, and ruled by decree. His inner circle shifted constantly as he removed anyone he saw as a threat, real or imagined. International observers described his leadership as chaotic, but inside Uganda, the consequences were very real. Disappearances became routine, and speaking out carried serious consequences. Amin often presented himself as jovial and strong, but beneath the surface, his rule brought economic collapse, isolation, and widespread suffering. By the time he was forced into exile, the country was left fractured and struggling to recover. Robert Mugabe began his rule in Zimbabwe as a symbol of liberation and education. For years, he was praised for promoting literacy and reconciliation. But as his grip on power tightened, his methods changed. Land reforms intended to reverse colonial inequalities turned into chaotic seizures that shattered the economy. Opposition parties were harassed, elections manipulated, and critics silenced. State media painted him as the eternal father of the nation, while food shortages and inflation soared. Mugabe blended nationalist rhetoric with ruthless tactics, remaining in office for decades despite growing unrest. In the end, it wasn't protest or foreign pressure that removed him, but a quiet push from his own allies, who had grown tired of a legacy built on both pride and repression.
Bashar al-Assad did not originally seek power. Trained as an eye doctor, he inherited Syria's presidency after his father's passing and was seen by some as a potential reformer. But when protests erupted in 2011, he responded not with change, but with force. What began as unrest quickly escalated into a prolonged and devastating civil conflict. His government used overwhelming military power, including sieges, airstrikes, and tactics condemned by international observers. Cities were reduced to ruins, and millions were displaced. Through it all, Assad held on, using alliances, media, and state institutions to maintain control. He presented himself as a stabilizing force amid chaos, but the price of that stability was immeasurable for the people caught in the middle. Far from global headlines, Islam Karimov ruled Uzbekistan with an iron hand for over 2 decades. After the Soviet Union's collapse, he built a new state with old methods, strict censorship, a loyal security apparatus, and no tolerance for opposition. His government tightly managed public expression, detaining activists and shutting down dissent before it could spread. One of the most brutal crackdowns came in 2005 when government forces opened fire on protesters in the city of Andijan, sparking international outrage. Yet inside the country, fear silenced most voices. Karimov's rule was marked by order, but it was an order enforced at every level, through surveillance, prison, and the quiet erasure of opposition over time.
Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini reshaped Iran not just politically, but spiritually and socially. After the 1979 revolution ousted the monarchy, he established a new system where religious authority governed every part of life. The promises of freedom that had fueled the uprising were quickly replaced with strict controls. Dissenters, from former allies to student protesters, faced harsh consequences. The press was limited, laws were rewritten, and personal freedoms were sharply reduced. Khomeini positioned himself as a divine guide, and his words carried more weight than any law. Even after his passing, the system he designed remained, a state where power flows from belief, and challenging that belief became not just illegal, but unthinkable.
Vladimir Putin rose to power at the turn of a century that had left Russia unstable and uncertain. He promised strength, order, and a return to pride. Early in his rule, he reined in regional governors, brought media outlets under tighter control, and signaled that the chaos of the 1990s was over. Over time, his leadership hardened. Opponents were sidelined, some under legal pressure, others silenced more directly. Foreign policy grew more assertive, marked by military actions that drew sharp global responses. At home, the narrative of unity and strength remained central, reinforced through television, institutions, and national pride. While supporters see him as a protector of Russian sovereignty, critics describe a system where power has grown increasingly concentrated and dissent increasingly risky.